So I can, if Melissa's pulling that up, I'll just kind of provide a little more context. And Harriet really already did a great job there. We were happy to share with this group what we know about this upcoming, or I should say ongoing, public comment opportunity with the Corps of Engineers. We've been working on Corps of Engineers issues at National Wildlife Federation for many decades under the thought leadership of Melissa's great work, you know, both in terms of national policy, but also specific projects. And Melissa is going to give an overview in just a minute here of kind of a little bit more about the agency and how it works. We didn't want to assume everybody has a ton of experience with the Corps, and so we'll provide just a little bit more context about the agency itself. But just to ground us in this opportunity at hand, as you heard, the Corps has an open public comment opportunity on a series of policy initiatives that are designed to, what they're saying, modernize their civil works and regulatory programs. These fall into the topical areas of Native American and tribal nation issues, potential rulemaking actions regarding some of their regulatory program work, and some of their work related to the principles, requirements, and guidelines, which is a very wonky concept that Melissa will break down for you, and just a little bit here if you're not familiar with that, but a really important aspect of Corps planning. And then, of course, environmental justice, including definitions the agency is going to be using for specific terms, and just generally looking for input from communities on ways to improve how they're engaging with communities and with tribes. And so there is very detailed information in the Federal Register notice. We linked it here, but we'll also drop it in the chat. I can do that in just a minute while Melissa's presenting. And you can there find a lot more information about the specific items they're requesting input on, as well as a link to a webinar they've already completed describing this public comment opportunity. So we're going to summarize a lot of that for you, but if you want to hear it directly from the Corps, that will also link you to that webinar. And then the information about the upcoming listening and public comment sessions that they're hosting this week and next week. So again, we'll share all of those links. After Melissa's overview, I'll break down a little bit more detail of the types of questions this public comment opportunity, the types of things they're soliciting input on. And then we have some kind of our initial ideas and recommendations that we'll quickly run through and would welcome this group's feedback on. But we also really want to make sure there's tons of time just for discussion and to hear about your experiences with the agency, which already from intros, it sounds like is plentiful. And so hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussion about some key messages for this comment opportunity. So with that, Melissa, let me go ahead and turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. I'll just add to what Jessie said before I start in on the overview of the Corps, is your voices really are important to this process. And one thing I think is important to recognize is you really don't need to know the nitty-gritty of the Corps, all the Corps programs to make a difference here. The real need is to tell the Corps what you want them to be doing when they're planning projects, how you want them to be engaging with communities, what you want them to consider and value, and what you want them to be doing. And all of that can be morphed into whatever their regulation process is at the end of the day. But the Corps really needs to hear from communities in a very major way. So just keep that in mind. I think, again, you don't need to know all the nitty-gritty gory details. It's just, it helps, but you don't need to know. And we're also here to answer any questions you might have. So I wanted to just start with a quick overview of the Corps' program, mostly to give you a sense of the enormous reach of the agency, which I think gets hidden in a lot of ways from the public, and the massive impacts that their decision-making can have on communities, on resources, on the economy, the nature-based economy, the outdoor economy. I mean, most people tend to deal with the Corps on a project-by-project basis. So you might deal with the Corps, you have a project. For some of you who live in New Orleans or maybe in coastal regions, you're dealing with the Corps multiple times, but other people will just see the Corps once or twice, they'll deal with it. But really, the things that you say and the input that you give can have major impacts across the country in improving Corps planning. So I just really wanted to highlight that value of that. For those of you who don't know, the Corps is everywhere in the continental United States and in Alaska and in Hawaii, and then in some transatlantic divisions and stuff in Europe. Their civil works program is broken down into 8 divisions. They've got 38 districts that fall within the divisions. The divisions are highlighted on the map in the colors. They have a top layer of military personnel, and they switch a lot. So the military rotates in and out. So they're there for a couple of years, then they move on. And then they have their baseline civilian planners and planning expertise. Their projects, their major projects, primary mission areas is what they call them, focused on flood control, navigation, and ecosystem restoration. But they do a lot more stuff than that. And the flood control projects are, as you can see, 11,750 miles of federal levees. There are hundreds of dams, hundreds of flood control reservoirs, many thousands of miles of navigation channels, harbors, locks and dams. Ecosystem restoration, large-scale projects, many, including restoration of the Everglades is a major core project. Some work in other areas, the upper Mississippi River, the LA River out here in California where I live. They have run 75 hydropower facilities. They actually have the biggest largest number of recreation sites for any federal agency. They do water supply. They do small-scale projects. They run the Silver Jackets program. So the agency has this enormous reach. They also have, you see the $100 billion project backlog. That's $100 billion of projects that Congress has approved, but that have not yet been constructed. So there's a lot of potential for good. There's a lot of potential for more bad if they don't sort of shift, I think, some of their planning approaches. So I just wanted to highlight, just to give people a sense who aren't maybe as familiar with the Corps, on how damaging some of their large scale projects can be. So this is New Orleans on the eastern side. And for those of you from New Orleans, whatever I mess up here, please jump in, correct me. I think I mostly have it right, but I don't live in New Orleans. So on the eastern communities, on the eastern side of the Inner Harbor Canal is the lower Ninth Ward of New Orleans. The Corps wants to expand this lock that is existing and has been in place for many, many decades. They basically want to rip out the existing lock, build a new lock a little bit farther into the city. And it has lots of problems, this project, for communities in particular. And the lower Ninth Ward communities have been opposing this project now for decades. Since I started working on the Corps, this has been a project they've been trying to fight off with minimal success, and it keeps coming back to life. Some of the key problems, major resuspension of toxic sediments when they're going to be dredging the river channel. They have to blast out the existing lock, which is the size of a skyscraper, buried underneath that river channel that you really can't see much of. It's massive. So major shaking, explosions, infrastructure, home structures, people are really concerned. Really risk of increasing flooding by pulling the river in kind of closer into the city. 10 years of construction with major congestion, bridge replacements, slowdowns, air pollution, noise. People in the lower Ninth Ward do not want this project, and they have been adamantly opposed to it. But the Corps not really listening. They listen, but they don't really change their plans. So that's one project. Another example of one of their larger scale projects on the 195-mile stretch of the Mississippi River that's located between the Ohio River and the Missouri River. The Corps has built these navigation structures to help maintain navigation that have increased flood heights in that stretch of the river by 5 to 6 feet in some locations, up to 15 feet in some locations. Massive, massive increases in flood levels because of stuff the Corps has put in the river to reduce dredging costs to maintain navigation. Not all the Corps projects are this big. Not all Corps projects are bad. Some of them are very helpful, but there is this potential, and there is this there's this bias for these large scale projects and a historic amount of large scale structural projects that are out there that the agency has constructed and is constructing. And a lot of their major restoration efforts are actually undoing things that they did in the past that have turned out to not be good. Everglades restoration is very significant in that construct. Gloria, did you want to ask a question? I don't want to, I see your hand
Yeah,
up.
just real quickly about the Ninth Ward. I'm very familiar with it. Who's not liking it? The people that live there now or the people that are gentrifying it?
I believe it's been all the way through, is my understanding. Citizens Against the Widening of the Industrial Canal is the group, but there are many, many people who have been there historically, because this project has been in play, since, like, I sort of started with the Corps around 1997. They've been fighting the project since then. So before gentrification, whether it is continuing after gentrification, probably, I don't know, but definitely longstanding community members have expressed opposition to us in their
Thank you.
conversation. Yeah. So another thing that the Corps does is they run it's called the regulatory program. And the primary thing that affects most people with respect to this program is the Corps issues Clean Water Act Section 404 permits. These are permits that allow individuals, industry, homeowners, anybody to dredge and fill wetlands and small streams, and big streams too. There are impacts for all stream and waters of the US, but this is a huge program of the Corps. They issue 69,000 Clean Water Act permit actions a year, give or take. Those range from regional permits and nationwide permits for sort of smaller scale activities to individual permits that might have a housing development for 100 acres or 300 acres of wetland impacts. So they range the full gamut from like a quarter of an acre on up. The Corps has asked for input on environmental justice and tribal issues with respect to the regulatory program, in addition to that civil work side of the world. And just to keep in the back of your mind, the planning principles, requirements, and guidelines that I'll be talking about later after Jessie steps in here again, does not deal with the regulatory program, right? So there are different rules that apply to their civil work side and their regulatory side. So just something to keep in the back of your mind for folks who aren't that familiar with the agency. So I think, again, just highlighting the fact that the agency has this massive reach with really significant impacts, the ability to do things well and help communities, and the ability and history, unfortunately, of doing things in a way that is not helpful at all, and it's often aggravating and increasing problems. And so I think that's Core 101 in a nutshell, and I will turn it over to you, Jessie, and feel free to build on that if I've missed anything major.
Thanks, Melissa. So just digging in a little bit more in terms of some of the things that this comment period is asking for communities to weigh in on. There's a bit of additional backdrop here that we thought it was worth mentioning to this group, which is that this current open public comment period is driven by a number of things, including the Biden administration's priorities around environmental justice and around climate resilience. But it's also in large part being driven by provisions that Congress passed in the Water Resources Development Act of 2020, WRDA as it's commonly called. And this is a piece of legislation that Congress passes typically every 2 years as of late, that directs the Corps in terms of their policy and their project authorizations. And in the WRDA 2020 bill, we actually saw some really meaningful provisions directing the agency to improve how it engages with communities. And I summarized some of those on the slide here. There's this whole section that essentially requires the Corps to update its policies on environmental justice, to strengthen its tribal consultation requirements, to improve and increase meaningful involvement with minority communities, economically disadvantaged communities. Congress directed the Corps to prioritize resiliency planning assistance to economically disadvantaged communities. They established a pilot program, actually 2 pilot programs under Section 118 of WRDA 2020 that we paid a lot of attention to, and we're really involved in one of these 2 pilot programs and championing this through the process. And the idea is that Congress authorizes the Corps to select a number of studies that can be carried out at full federal expense to address a flooding, hurricane, or storm damage issue that has a disproportionate impact on a rural community, a minority community, or an Indian tribe that doesn't have, you know, a lot of times the cost share we know is a challenge, right? So this is sort of a directive that the Army Corps should be looking to engage directly in helping communities solve these types of challenges, even if they don't have a non-federal cost share partner or resources available. So this particular provision in the pilot programs was actually funded in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but, and Melissa can correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe we've actually seen any implementation guidance or seen it move forward yet. So this is just one I wanted to be sure to flag for this group, because we're certainly hoping a lot of communities will take advantage of this and benefit from this new program that is just now, you know, newly authorized and not yet used. So that's another piece and something that I think, you know, merits comment in this comment period. And then, of course, the directive to define the term economically disadvantaged community. And you'll find in the Federal Register notice that there is actually a draft definition for folks to react to, respond to, provide feedback on. I want to mention there are a couple other really, I think, valuable provisions in the environmental justice space that are currently being negotiated as part of the WRDA 2022 bill. And I'll mention a few of those in the next few slides, but also very happy to continue a conversation later offline if folks are interested in learning more or engaging in WRDA 2020 as that process is ongoing. So all that's to say that the basis for this comment period is actually congressional directives, you know, which is great because it's more than just this current administration set of priorities. This is in law. These are things they have to do, and really want them to do this meaningfully now that we have this open public comment period. Next slide. Oh, Harriet, I see you had a question. Was this about the pilot program?
Yes, I was just interested in if it was a pilot program, is that for a study, and is it possible that they're doing that through the Silver Jackets? Because I know the Silver Jackets has had a massive influx of funding.
I don't think it's limited to Silver Jackets. The Silver Jackets certainly may have a role in helping connect communities with the opportunity and helping facilitate it. Melissa, does that sound right?
Yeah, that's right. I think it's actually separate. I believe it's actually considered separate from Silver Jackets, so it would be additive. At least that's the way it's been presented to us. As Jessie said, the Corps has not developed their guidance for how they're going to implement this program. So that's, it may be a little bit up in the air, but it should be complementary. I would just add one other aspect to that program is, in exchange for that directive and that full federal funding, and also to benefit communities, the real reason, that pilot program does require a very significant and careful look at nature-based solutions, not so basically ecosystem restoration or mimicking nature and how the natural process would work to reduce flooding, and using other non-structural and type measures, elevation, floodproofing, flood easement, stuff like that. So that's a very huge component of that piece as well. Yeah.
Great. So now just digging in a little deeper again on some of the specific items they're requesting input on right now. So first I should say, by way of additional context, and I'm going to drop something else in the chat here, you'll see in the Federal Register notice that they mentioned that in March of this year, the Assistant Secretary of the Army issued some interim guidance for the Corps on environmental justice in compliance with recent executive orders. They are signaling that part of this comment period is to collect information to inform finalization of that guidance. I've linked to the guidance just now in the chat. It is fairly short and very high level. And so certainly from our perspective, I think, you know, one hopeful outcome would be that there's guidance that's a little bit more detailed, that potentially and includes more considerations that comes out of this process. But I linked that there for you to take a look. And then, you know, this list of bullets here, these are really kind of, again, some of the more specific things they're looking for input on. How do we improve community outreach and access to core information and resources? There are some specific technical service programs that the Corps runs that they'd like any input on, and how they could improve those things. Planning assistance to states is one, floodplain management services, and the continuing authorities programs. Those are all areas where they're asking for specific input. They want input on how the Corps implements the Justice 40 initiative. They're looking for feedback on how to actually incorporate EJ guidance into the regulatory program that Melissa spoke about a few moments ago, including things like Clean Water Act permitting that the Corps is responsible for. They want input on how to assess benefits to disadvantaged and underserved communities, and also how to ensure that projects don't have unintended adverse consequences for those communities. We mentioned defining some terms, including economically disadvantaged community, and then updates to the Tribal Partnership Program and the Tribal Consultation Policy. Both of these are things that already exist. The Corps just hasn't updated them in a long time, so this is an opportunity for them to revisit and refine and improve upon those things. I'll also say that there, you know, and we'll touch on this at the end, there's a series of listening sessions in the coming weeks. They signal in the Federal Register notice that this is sort of their national comment period, but they intend and plan to do more community outreach through their district. And so, you know, this is something that I very much hope is actually going to happen, and something that if you have a relationship with your core district, it might be an opportunity this comment period to reach out for a dialogue in that context as well. So next slide, please, Melissa. So we have a few slides that just contain some of our ideas and thinking in this space based on our partnerships with communities, our internal expertise at NWS, and with our environmental justice program colleagues and our tribal partnership program colleagues. So this list is certainly not comprehensive, but some ideas that we thought we would flag, and then we really want your feedback on these, but also just, again, like open brainstorming and dialogue with you. So I'm going to go quickly through this because I want to leave plenty of time for discussion today. But here's some ideas for things that we hope to communicate with the Corps at this comment period. Of course, the best practice of engaging with communities up front and not after the plans are developed, as we so often see, and actually listening and changing projects to affect community and tribal concerns. This obviously isn't only a best practice with the Corps, or something we struggle with in the context of the Corps, but it certainly applies in this context. This bullet about giving the Corps staff the resources, training, and time they need to build authentic relationships is, I think, in our view, a really important piece, because the agency just isn't necessarily currently equipped to do this work and this community outreach and relationship building appropriately or well. One idea in the current WRDA bill that's out there floating that has gotten a lot of traction is the idea of having in each core district tribal liaisons, essentially, a specific staff person who is designated for that really important work of engaging with tribal governments around project ideas, you know, before the project planning even kicks off. So early and often feedback with tribes. So that's just one example of what this could look like, but there's probably a lot of different forms this should take. And then, of course, Melissa mentioned the nature-based solutions piece. The idea here, you know, is just how can we really encourage the agency to design projects that don't just solve one problem, but multi-purpose projects that actually have co-benefits for communities in terms of recreational opportunities, clean water, wildlife, so on and so forth. And so that's the idea behind that bullet. Next slide. And I hope we're capturing, I definitely want to capture the chat to review it later, because I'm not able to read everything as it's coming in, and I see there's some good information there. And then we mentioned these pilot programs. We want to see these pilot programs advance quickly, and we want to see them, something we're fighting for right now in WRDA 2022 is to remove the sunset and hopefully have it so that we can have more than, I think right now it's capped at 10 pilot programs. So just pushing for these pilot programs to be less pilot and more institutionalized, because we know the need is there. There's always concerns that we have with toxics when it comes to core projects, because these projects often dredge up and stir up pollutants like heavy metals and PCBs in sediment. And so ensuring that the Corps actually is considering the risks of flooding heavily contaminated sites, of the impacts of their projects on pollution in the region. So that's an important aspect. We talked a little about technical assistance. How specifically could we try to prioritize and strengthen technical assistance and resiliency planning for communities? What does that look like? And then considering a community's ability to pay and setting affordable community costs for assistance so that more communities can access Army Corps expertise to help them solve their water resource challenges. Next slide. This topic of benefit cost analysis, I don't know how much this has bubbled up to any of your radars, but right now the way that the Corps does their benefit cost analysis, and this is an issue in the context of FEMA and other federal agencies too, it can actually disadvantage projects that protect lower income communities because of the way they conduct the benefit cost analysis, oftentimes basing it on the value of home prices. Major problem. This is something that we think that this current comment period is very relevant to this current comment period, and it's also relevant to the principles, requirements, and guidelines issue, and something that we're hoping that will be addressed. Something we've asked for a while is that the Army Corps needs to establish a senior advisor for environmental justice, and they should have a federal advisory committee to advise Corps leadership on increasing equitable delivery of projects and services. There is actually in the Senate Word a bill that's currently before the Senate, a provision trying to drive at this point of a federal advisory committee. And so, making some progress on this concept and this idea, it all comes back to increasing the Corps' capacity. And then we're going to talk more about PR&G in a minute, so I won't go into that right now, but making sure the PR&G accounts for environmental injustice. And then lastly, in considering this definition of economically disadvantaged communities, we think that the Environmental Justice for All Act definition is worth the Corps really taking a careful look at because of all of the input that we know went into crafting that definition and all the engagement from so many communities that went into crafting that. So that's just one other idea that we had to present to the agency. So with that, I don't know if there's any questions. I just went through a lot and I talked a little fast in the hopes of preserving more time for discussion. Melissa, there's one more segment we wanted to share, but let me just pause for any questions on this piece before Melissa finishes up.
I don't think so. And unless people have got I don't think anyone's got their hands up. So maybe Melissa go on and then we'll open it up. I certainly have comments and I'm sure lots of others have. Oh, Amy's got her hand up. Amy?
Actually, this may be more appropriate in the general questions.
Okay.
But so should I wait?
Yeah.
Okay, I can wait.
Okay, great. So I'm going to talk. Sorry about the inability for me somehow or other to change my screen without giving you guys motion sickness. I apologize for that. I wanted to talk to you about the planning principles, requirements, and guidelines, which is massively wonky, and I apologize, but it actually has a very meaningful and critical implications for the way the Corps plans projects. This document, the PR&G is what they're calling it now, tells the Corps and other federal agencies how they are to plan and evaluate federal water resources projects. So again, this applies to the quote civil work side for projects that other federal agencies are also constructing. This is not dealing with a regulatory component, just to keep an eye on that. I think it's important to recognize what the current requirements are and what the changes, because the changes in the PR&G are actually quite significant. And just so you are aware, this is actually two separate documents. There's a document called the Principles and Requirements. There's a document called the Guidelines to implement the principles and requirements. And now we're coming up to the Corps developing its own guidelines to further refine and implement this process for how they're planning projects. The current approach, because the Corps technically can't use the PR&G until they develop their own internal guidance on how to do it. So the Corps' current approach was first developed in 1983. It requires the agency to maximize national economic development, and it makes environmental concerns a constraint on project planning. A key part of this process is calculating project costs and benefits. And I'll go into this a little bit more detail because the benefits have to exceed the cost for navigation projects and for flood control projects. A slightly different standard applies to restoration projects where you really just have to produce environmental outcomes, right? So it's not benefit cost per se. So what does all that mean? Maximize national economic development, then look at the environmental stuff. What it means is the Corps plans a project to increase economic outputs. And then once it has that plan in place, it makes some adjustments to the project to make that a bit less damaging to communities and the environment, at least we hope, right? That's kind of the process, and that's the thought process and really how it plays out. And part of that, again, is calculating project costs and benefits. Okay? So this has resulted in what the Army Inspector General at one point found to be, quote, an institutional bias for building large scale structural projects. So it's not just the environmental community or others saying this process that's been in place since '83 is not working for people and for the environment, but the federal government itself has made these findings. And you can see how this sort of plays out in a very, really horrifying way. And I think the lower Ninth Ward, what happened to New Orleans in the lower Ninth Ward during Hurricane Katrina is a really good example of how poor planning can really cause lots of problems. Planning that doesn't consider communities, that doesn't consider the environment. So a series of core projects that had been in the works for a very long time before Hurricane Katrina had really caused a major loss of Louisiana's vital coastal wetlands. Those wetlands weren't there to help buffer the storm surge from Katrina. Then what happened was one of those projects, the Mississippi River Gulf Outlet, which was a navigation channel dredged by the Corps over the objection of many communities, actually funneled that storm surge into the heart of the lower Ninth Ward. So it made the storm surge churn around and churn and churn, and it hit the lower Ninth with a wall of water, and people could not escape. And that's why so many people died there. It was, as you can see, and for those of you who were there, I don't have to explain how horrifying and horrible that was. There were levee and flood wall failures in other parts of the city as well, of course. Those failures actually caused flooding and bad flooding, and people suffered. But the flooding was a little slower, at least, so people could get out of harm's way. So you have the massive number of destruction and really, and all the majority of the deaths in the lower Ninth Ward. So following Hurricane Katrina, come around in 2007, there was a big push to change what the Corps was doing and how it was planning, in part based on what happened in New Orleans and the real damage on the ground, which you could actually see from the result of poor planning, helped to drive that. But it was also other projects across the country that helped drive this change. And Congress told the Corps to develop new planning guidelines to get rid of those 83 guidelines, replace new ones. And then they also established a national water resources planning policy to help drive how that was going to come out, right? To say what core projects and other federal water resources projects should be doing. So instead of saying maximize national economic development, the new water planning policy says all water resource projects should reflect national priorities, encourage economic development, and protect the environment. Not try to protect the environment, not strive to protect the environment, but protect the environment. And then it gives more direction. So your economic development proposals for core projects should actually be maximizing sustainable economic development. So kind of different issues. The core projects should be avoiding unwise use of floodplains and flood-prone areas. They should be minimizing adverse impacts to people who live in those areas. And the Corps should protect and restore the functions of natural systems and mitigate any unavoidable damage to those systems to help protect the environment. So this is the new approach that water resources planning is supposed to be taking. The new PR&G, which was actually released under, so this was in 2007, the PR&G didn't get released until the Obama administration. So there were lots of twists and turns and Congress saying this and do that and don't do that. But they actually came out with the PR&G, the Obama administration, and they followed this national planning policy as would make sense and as was right. And those planning guidelines, the PR&G, also tell the Corps to count the value of ecosystem services lost as a project cost and to count the value of ecosystem services gained as a project benefit. And this is really important. The whole thrust of the PR&G, if you read through it and its wonkiness, and I'll go through that, it's really talking about the value of nature and accounting for that with respect to protecting communities, with respect to the environment, with respect to the need to create resiliency for all of us across the country. So the PR&G have the capacity to transform core planning in a meaningful way. And now the Corps is finally getting around to developing its agency-specific procedures, which, by the way, had been prohibited. They'd been prohibited by Congress from doing so. You know how Congress is and lots of machinations around the Corps. So now we're in a place where this can really start to take off for this agency to make these kinds of projects, the kinds of projects that meet the National Water Resource Planning Policy, a reality, as opposed to the types of projects we have historically seen. We have come up, as Jessie said, with a whole number of suggestions. I'm just going to highlight some of them that I think are probably most relevant for this call, but there are lots of ideas floating around there to actually say, how do you get from point A to point B here? How do we get from where we are to where we need to be? One thing that I would say is if you are wanting to engage in this concept is to tell the Corps that they have to have real clear criteria. So that's one piece of it. In any of these, in any way you want to describe these, very clear criteria. Susan, I see your hands up. Do you want me to go through these? Do you want to have a question first? I'd like to answer if you do.
No, I'll wait. I'm just in line behind Amy.
Gotcha. Okay, great. So a couple of things I think that are really critical, and some of what you heard from Jessie, right? That they overlap with the environmental justice issues and tribal rights issues. Involve communities up front, not after the plans are developed, which is what typically will happen. Not in every case, but in many cases. A local sponsor proposes a project, the Corps develops a plan, a draft comes out, things are kind of set in stone, and then the community gets engaged. So that's one thing. Tell the Corps that they have to change projects to address communities' concerns. It doesn't mean they're going to maybe change the whole thing, but somehow or other they need to address what communities are saying here, right? And not just listen and ignore. We hear that a lot. They listen to you, they have to take your comments and they respond back, but they tend to not respond by changing what they're doing on the ground. The Corps should be affirmatively planning projects to redress environmental injustices and not just have that be sort of a out there kind of a thing. It happens, maybe happenstance, maybe it doesn't. Another thing Jessie touched on, right? Equitably accounting for the costs and benefits of projects to disadvantaged communities, low-income communities. Make sure you're actually accounting for things in a way that makes sense and will benefit communities and not harm them. Requiring exploration of solutions that use those natural nature-based measures, non-structural measures as a first step in project planning. Then if you need more, build on that with structure instead of flipping what they're doing now. Because those kinds of solutions are more resilient. They're often, not always, but they're often cheaper. They provide many co-benefits. Another thing that I think might be very useful for the Corps to hear is to just say no to projects that cause more harm than good. And they can say no to projects. The agency can definitely recommend no project and say these are not in the public interest. A lot of Corps projects are like a levee project. Other types of projects will actually divert floodwater to an upstream or downstream community, depending on what the project is. They can increase exposure to toxic pollution very significantly if remediation isn't a component of the project. Want to remove barriers to helping economically disadvantaged communities when they do need help and they want a good flood project to help them. And that goes to this point of example, not saying your benefit cost analysis is based on the benefits based on home values, so that only communities with home values of 250,000 and up actually have enough benefits from this flood project that they get assistance, right? So that's that piece of accounting equitably and also making sure you're properly looking at what the benefits are, community lives, livelihoods, whether a community can thrive. Building toxic remediation into plans. Instead of just dredging and hoping that stuff doesn't wind up in everybody's, fish or in their drinking water or in their air. And then again, counting ecosystem services gained as a project benefit and counting ecosystem services lost as a project cost. So these are some of the ideas that we've come up with. And again, we have sort of other detailed recommendations that are more in that, detailed, wonky, or how to steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 process that I can talk about as well. But just wanted to highlight some of these, but really mostly here wanting to hear what you have to say and what your thoughts are on how to improve core planning. And with that, I think that's the end of our quote formal presentation.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Really appreciate it. It's fantastic. So we have 4 hands up. Let's start with Amy.
Hi, this is a question, I guess, about the Corps' like philosophy. How do they process things? So you said that the folks in the lower Ninth Ward have been fighting the industrial canal project since 1995. Why, when you consistently get that much pushback from community, I mean, what was the Corps saying? Why do they not listen, or why haven't they? I'm glad that we're going in a different direction, but I don't quite understand the consistent pushback from community and basically the Corps saying, so what? And the project isn't even feasible. So what's going through their heads?
Amy, it's since the 70s, the late 70s. I know our organization was fighting it since then.
Even worse. Well, the presenter was saying she started in 95. So that's even worse, Beth.
Well,
Oh,
I can,
exactly.
I can give my views. I think Jessie may have other thoughts, but actually those of you who've been dealing with the Corps on these issues on a regular basis probably actually have more insight to offer. But there are a couple of things. Is one, historically, the agency they're required to listen. The National Environmental Policy Act requires the agency to accept comments and to respond to comments. So they have to, quote, listen. But their driver has been national economic development. And Congress told them to do that. And that's what they've been doing. I mean, some of this is the agency's problem, created its own monster, created its own self-monster thing. Some of this is what congressional direction. But they wanted this navigation project. The navigation industry is pushing for this. They wanted it. They think that there's economic output benefits, and this is on their plate and is on their $100 billion project backlog, and they just continue to push it. We see this, it's not just this project. We see this over and over and over again, including in projects that have been like actually, quote, killed. This project is not allowed to move forward, and then the agency will come back and try to resurrect it down the road. And some of it is mindset, some of it is historical precedent, some of it is just inability to, unwillingness to sort of change an approach, and institutional inertia is a big part of it as well. This is a chance to change that inertia. That's how I view this opportunity. It's like, we're maybe this time we're at an inflection point where we can actually change what they're going to do and make it more real, what communities have to say.
Yeah, especially when the projects aren't producing, they aren't meeting their goal, right? The industrial canal project is not meeting its ultimate goal. So why continue? I don't understand it. But anyway, I have other thoughts, but I'll let other people have the floor.
Thank you. Susan.
We had a silver jacket study and it was wonderful. And you've seen my head almost shaking off the screen because I disagreed with so much of what was going on. But I'm not saying I don't love the Corps of Engineers. The men were absolutely awesome, but it was like their hands were tied or something. They came in and they told the city, okay, you need an alarm, a flood alarm. That's never happened. Told the city a substation has to be moved. That's never happened. The things, they went door to door and did a windshield version, which means they sat in the driveways and judged which homes needed to be elevated, which homes needed to be bought out. And that's never happened. What good does it do? They're just wasting the money. Kind of funny, on Friday, I had a hang-up call from Hal Grafe of the Corps of Engineers. And I thought, you didn't leave a message. But Harriet and I had sat and begged for them for 2 months at the beginning of this year. to come in and help us again. The gravel bars are so bad and they never say dredge, never. We need them cleaned, but instead they would rather have our people flood or our people move and evacuate the houses than to try to do any little thing. And I realize it's because these guys' hands are tied. They need to listen to the people a little bit more. Their core committee that they're getting ready to put needs to be of people, not politicians. Again, I love the Corps of Engineers, but we're not following through what they say to do. And they don't have the money. They said, help yourselves. So there's no money to fix it. So how do you help yourselves? So sorry for my head shaking.
No, yeah, I would say, I think, we have heard universally, and Jessie, please weigh in, that the people like the Silver Jackets program, and that what the Silver Jackets are producing and the recommendations are really valuable and helpful, and but they do have to get implemented. It is a different process than the civil works side, and so there are differences in approach and what the agency can do under those two separate programs, I think. Because once you get into a core project itself, with the core doing a project, a whole different set of circumstances and rules and regulations come into play. And you may also wind up with a whole different set of planners that the outcome may or may not be what the community most wants. So I would just highlight that as well, but it is a bit of an intractable problem. The agency does not have enough money to build the projects on its books. So that's a problem.
Thank you. Daryl.
Yeah, I think I wanted to address that. So because we had Army Corps of Engineers working with us in the Urban Water Federal Partnership, we had funding and they did an initial study, and then we were trying to get some other projects implemented within that. And the budgets that they get are based on, congressional budgets, right? And they usually change each year. And so there really isn't a mechanism inside to really address stopping or slowing or redirecting projects because of community input. So you mentioned a lot of your goals that were wonderful, but they're not really tied to the way the agency does business. The agency gets money through a congressional budget. Politicians decide on a prioritization of the budget, and community input is aspirational at best, in my opinion. So I'm just wondering if there's more in the policy and the legislation and of the possibilities to really assert community involvement, community voices, or will the limitations, especially in terms of the budget, how we spend money, where does the money come from? I just feel like that ultimately won't work within the framework of a community-led environmental justice initiative. What are your thoughts on that?
Jessie, I do have thoughts, but you go for it.
You go first? Okay. Well, I think you're raising such a critical point, Daryl, and I think even despite the fact that this is probably the most, I don't know, I've been working in the Corps not nearly as long as Melissa, but I think this is probably the biggest opportunity I've seen so far to actually maybe really change that inertia, that institutional inertia that we're talking about. I think that there's lots of lots of cynicism about how much we can actually change course here for all of those points that you just raised about just how this is just how they've been doing business, and so you have to kind of fundamentally change the policy approach. I think there's getting community requested and wanted projects moving, but then there's also stopping core actions that are advancing against community wishes and community interests, right? And so I think that the solution set for those two are slightly different. And I think we have to address both. And I think this is comment period is an opportunity to address both. But one thing that your comment, I think, prompted for me was just, you know, how do we actually make the input more meaningful? And you're right, this comes down to other laws and other policies the Corps operates under, like NEPA. And right now, you may know we're undergoing kind of a NEPA rulemaking process as well. And so this cross-cuts into different areas, right? But when it comes to that side of the coin, it's about helping to ensure that the Corps is working more with communities and prioritizing projects that communities want. I do think that there are some of these technical assistance prioritization pieces, the cost share assistance pieces, the actually getting capacity in the agency to do this proactive outreach. I think that there are some more tangible solutions there that we could start to point to, and you know, and we benefit greatly from the wisdom of this group on what some of the specific solutions could look like. But that's kind of what your comments prompted for me, some thoughts about how, you know, we are constrained by these broader laws. At the same time, I do think that within the realm of Corps policy and guidelines that they're updating, there might be some things that we can do here that are meaningful. But Melissa, what would you say?
Yeah, I totally agree. I think it's an opportunity. You know, I've been doing this for a long. I'm sure there's some of you on the call have been fighting the Corps for a long time. I have for a very long time. And you know, I came in as a whatever, young, and I'm like whatever, and it takes a long time, and it's not going to happen overnight. I think that's something. The baseline of what's there, what's already on the ground, all those other projects. There's a lot of hurdles to overcome, but if you don't switch these rules and the guidance, I think you never make that progress. I don't think it's going to be overnight. I would also say this. I would add this one other thought, Daryl, is that the Corps does come up with its own budget. Then Congress adds to it and not. So if you're able to really infuse some of these priorities into the agency enough, right, so that they budget for it internally in their proposed budget, some of that will stick. And once it sticks, it will probably stay, because it's very unusual that you see stuff that gets in and then all of a sudden gets redlined. I mean, you know, crossed out and it doesn't get funded. It might get added to. That's historically. So I do think that there are opportunities here, even with these policy changes, if you can convince the agencies to budget for what you want, if we can really ramp up the pilot program component of this, to get projects that are meaningful for communities and targeted and planned in a different way from start to finish. It's just something to think about. Yeah.
Thank you.
And just one thing, because it's just reflecting on what Ramona was saying and Ms. Jackie, you know, probably there has never been a coordinated response from a group of people who are saying, we've had enough, you know, and that's what we have the chance to do, just as we did probably for the first time ever for FEMA. We have the chance to all say collectively, actually now there's a group that cares and we're watching you. More than cares, we're being damaged by your policies and practices, and it's time for change. So Ramona said something good troubled. Yeah. Beth. Oh, and so and so we will try and coordinate a sign-on letter, but we will need your little mini stories. You know, I live in this community and this is how I'm being negatively impacted. And I know many of you are over 401, 404s, etc. Beth.
Thank you. This is all really enlightening. For Amy, I'd like you to know that Boise Bollinger's had a shipyard on the industrial canal forever, but he might have sold it. But that's one reason why we think that the Corps wants to expand the industrial canal up there so he can work on the ships. And after Hurricane Katrina, they were on the ground immediately bulldozing homes in the lower Ninth Ward in that area that were good houses, and they left the ones that had floated across the street and just set up a kind of a horror zone because they were trying to take that property, which became a much bigger fight. And if you have read John Barry's The Rising Tide, you know, the history of the Corps is in there. what this is about is industrialization, and that's really what the Corps has been about. Their economic development is industrialization. We've had it bad in Orleans, but St. Bernard has as well. When they designed our levees and made them too weak, and they were poorly designed and poorly executed, they failed during the storm. But the Corps knew that they were going to fail. This is all front page news after Hurricane Katrina. And there was a letter from the Corps of Engineers from their headquarters at Vicksburg to the Corps in New Orleans that said, y'all's levees are weak. What are you going to do about it? And our Corps responded from New Orleans, we don't have to do anything about it. Yeah, we know. So they knew they were going to fail. In fact, President Bush was told, and nobody told us, which is why, so many people died and had their lives ruined. That's how rapacious they are. And of course, they never owned up to it or apologized. After this, they were working on a federal levee in St. Bernard Parish, and some engineers over there caught them putting in levees without these metal teeth or something. And the Corps said, well, the contractor said it was too expensive. So you have these other ways that they can damage the community while the community thinks they're getting these federal flood level levees, but somehow some contractor is able to get permission to not build them to specifications. This is a very serious issue. The other thing I don't understand about the levee situation is how do they understand the broader implication of building all these levees? Because when the water comes in one area and hits that levee, where does that water go? I just don't personally think that this is being planned out or thought out. And I think the implication is that somebody's going to, get a lot of water they weren't planning on. And just, it's not the Corps to do it with the broader picture in mind. We had, when we were fighting them and we sued them because they wouldn't let us participate in mitigation meetings. And of course, that's a federal First Amendment right. They literally lied to the judge right in front of us. I was so shocked. And she was so willing to let their lie stand that I was reminded that they're both, part of the same federal government, that they have all this standing and here we are as citizens, and the government wants to believe them. So it's really a huge problem. We ended up getting into the meetings politically, but that's a different story. But they try to divide up the communities, and they're very effective at it. So right now, what they will try to do is define what's in a historical area. Well, if you don't define in a large enough area that's historical, you're going to lose some political allies you need in the bigger fight. And that happened here recently, within the last few years. So there are other implications of like how they manage their business, but a lot of how they handle it is duplicitous and it's subterfuge. There's just no compunction about how they'll handle their business. So I really feel like some of these, ways that the court uses their own little rules about who gets to be involved in the meetings is a way for them to groom people and give people money. We found out about politicians getting mitigation money. They have strategies. They're on their game all the time. So how would we ever, get that into these remarks?
Thank you. We'll give it a go. Thanks, Beth. I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to move over to Lorena.
Hi, thanks. I'm just gonna leave the video off because my Wi-Fi is iffy. So I'm in Connecticut and we have that airport expansion happening in a cereal bowl with the wetlands. So what's happening here with U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, they've approved these 800-page permits that nobody knew about. And those permits contain mitigation plans with people who are supposed to be our allies. For example, the Audubon Society. Because we have the largest New England migration of birds over this airport territory. Now they cannot do any regulatory opinion or any stance against airport expansion because they're getting the money through these permits and this program called the Connecticut in Loop program. And what's been happening over the last 3 months is that we take the permit and then we see what they've done and it doesn't match. So then we question it. But the way to question it is I have to call the enforcement officials in my state agency. So now it's federal versus state, and I have to explain to the state why the federal permit is not being followed. So the burden on me as an environmental justice community to now go back to my state agency and explain to them what they have to enforce, how they didn't enforce it, and how that's a violation of trust for any kind of future mitigation is a daunting feat that we've had to do in terms of photographing, videotaping, and getting these people on public record to admit that they have faulty engineering. And we're not the engineers, and we notice this. So basically they're building ditches that are unsafe, that are not correct. And it's creating a problem because we are part of the NEPA process right now. We're in the middle of an environmental assessment. We're trying to push it to an EIS. And in doing that, the airport takes little projects into these huge Army Corps of Engineer permits, but there's still the little dominoes. They never take into account the cumulative effect, the big picture. And that's what's missing. And when I go to the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer and I want to do freedom of information, it's blocked because I'm an individual, because I'm an organization. They'll give me an hour, 2 hours for free of research. For that, after that, it's like $35, $40 an hour. I have to know exactly what I want to get. The politicians could get it for free. I have to go through other state agencies to get the information and the maps and the drawings that I should have for free. Thank you.
Thank you. As you said, just not many weeks ago, we had a call about the Clean Water Act and the potential rollback of the protection for the clean waters. And what was interesting was that just about everyone on the call was representing waters that were protected by the Clean Water Act in theory, but actually, were not being protected. So the lack of enforcement and lack of proper processes, is a major problem. Gloria, and then Kevin.
Absolutely, Harriet. We've got raw sewage right now going into the beach by my house, and nothing's happening with it. My question is, what's your working definition of environmental justice? It's a specialty of mine. It's what my PhD's in. So, and I continue to work in disenfranchised communities. So how are y'all defining that? Is there a checklist? Because some of the disenfranchised communities I'm associated with, they're not necessarily poor. They can't move, like me. I can't move. And my house keeps getting destroyed and I live in a sewage. And they're not in flood zones, but they continue to get flooded because of unregulated landfills. So it's a twofer. And I've never heard the Army Corps coming in Pensacola at all, unless it came in during Ivan. I looked up, I see an address, but there isn't a local phone number. So I don't know how much impact they have in Pensacola. So that's two things I'd like to know, and then y'all go on. Sort of your definition and how do you get in touch with it in your own backyard?
Jessie, oh, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Gloria, I don't know if you were specifically asking for NWS definition or just generally this group, how this group, uses that definition. The Corps, I don't think has a super specific definition. I think they're trying to refine that. And I think that they want to hear from all of us on what that should entail. We do have an organizational definition that I can send you if you're interested offline and would welcome your thoughts on that. That's something that our environmental justice team has been workshopping for a while. And so happy to, if you send me your email in the chat, I can send you what our working definition is, but maybe I'll leave it there just because I know we have one more comment and we're almost out of time.
Yes, sorry. Kevin.
Miss Melissa and Miss Jessie, we thank you for being here today and hearing us out. I think that's a first step, and I think it's very important. I live down here in Richwood, Texas, down around Lake Jackson, south of Houston. I'm a community leader down here, and I believe that the Corps of Engineers, and I want to thank the Corps because they help us out to a certain extent. I think the Corps of Engineers should canvass community leaders and not just municipalities and drainage districts, and look at our views, because we are on the front lines and we are the people, and we are going to tell you the truth. Municipalities and their greed, and county commissioners and counties and in drainage districts, they all are together and they don't want to share any of what they have out there. I'm in the middle of it right now. And I think that the Corps should canvass the community leaders and get our opinions, as well as the municipalities and the drainage districts. We want to protect the environment. We also need to keep big industry out of the pockets of the Corps of Engineers, such as Dow Chemical, that's huge down here, that was at the Addicks Reservoir one night about midnight with nobody knowing it, changing the direction of water, putting tons of rock up there, and nobody knows about it. We have reason to believe they did this at a big level. Dow Chemical owns the city of Lake Jackson down here. Dow Chemical owns the way the water flows down here. The Corps of Engineers needs to get it right in the middle of this with the drainage districts and the municipalities. And everyone needs to quit passing the buck, and let's be proactive on this and let's get the job done. And I think it's huge because groups like Higher Ground and Anthropocene Alliance are building and coming on with it. And we won't stop. And we need, as long as we can get the help of the Corps, okay, it'll go better. And as long as we can get the help of the municipalities and lay politics aside. And that's where we have a problem here, is with politics. And it's everywhere. It's everywhere. And we need to just get that out of the way and sit down with these people and let's tell it how it is. Let's be honest with each other. We're all grown-ups. We're all human grown-ups. And we need to get it right. And it starts with the Corps of Engineers. It starts with the municipalities. And it starts with us, the people in our communities, to help get this right. Thanks for your time.
Yay. Whoa, thank you, Kevin. You finished us in the perfect way. Melissa and Jessie, thank you so much for your time. Really appreciate it. If you, yes, Jessie, you said that you'd send us your notes. So we'll put together, we've already got the kind of draft letter that the letter that we did for FEMA, and much of it is still so relevant to this that it shouldn't be too hard for us to get a joint sign-on letter. But I would love to gather your stories as well. So do help me gather stories that we could put in that. And then if you could sign up for as many of those hearings as possible and use that time. And if you all don't mind saying you are part of A2 so that they know that we are working together jointly.
Yeah, I would just say, yes, tell your stories. Tell your stories live. In addition to the letters, you'll get 3 minutes, though. Keep that in mind. And they've been pretty strict at some of these to cut people off. So
good. Okay, we're good at telling stories. Yay, thank you all. Love you.
Thanks, y'all. This is great.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Have a good day.